Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this is our second to last class in our Astrological Magic series. So I think almost all of you have been here for the previous sessions. If you're just joining for the first time, you'll definitely want to have seen the previous classes. So just do your best, but you'll definitely want to go back. They're all the previous classes are up on YouTube now. And obviously for anyone watching on YouTube, you definitely want to start at the beginning. So today, this is going to be the last major section of talking about just astrology. So no real discussion of magic today, just filling in the last major components of astrology. And then in our last class, 2 weeks from now, will be a little bit of a grab bag of stuff, a few extra astrological pieces, some stuff about calendars, a few extra things on astrology, and then a couple more things on hexagram rituals that we didn't talk about, and then some summary and concluding thoughts and things like that. This is our last, the really core classes today. So as always, we've got a lot to get through, so let's just get right into it. So again, we're talking about astrology today. So our main topic for today is going to be the 12 astrological houses. But we're also going to do a little bit of talk about aspects as well, and developing some of the things that we already said about houses and aspects in our previous sessions. So we'll start with aspects because, as we'll see, some of the stuff relating to aspects is also relevant to understanding the meanings of the houses. As I tried to lay out in a month ago in our fourth class, a lot of the concepts of houses and aspects and signs, they're all really interrelated and interdependent with each other. So I tried to show how connected they are, and now we're breaking out and developing some of the individual pieces now that we've got a little bit of a sense of the broader scope in the total picture. All right, so this first slide here is just a summary of things we've already said about aspects, just reminding you and going over some of that stuff again. So we'll talk about degree-based aspects today too, but we're really starting from sign-based aspects. So we're talking about whole entire signs or whole signs and the aspects that they make to each other and the aspects that planets make to other planets just based on the signs and the relative positioning of those signs. So, and again, we're just using the classical, or what's sometimes called the Ptolemaic aspects here of conjunction, sextile, square, trine, and opposition. So in the chart there on the left, we've got just the aspects listed out, as well as the glyphs that are used to represent these aspects. As we talked, I'm not going to go through this now all again, but as we talked about in our fourth class, each of these aspects divides the 12 houses, divides the 12 signs and the 12 houses into like an equal into a whole number, right? So the sextile, that would, if you had like 6 planets that were all like in sextile to each other in different houses, that would trace like a hexagon around the sign, right? So there's this geometric logic going on. So let's just go one by one. So the conjunction or co-presence. Now again, the distinction between conjunction and co-presence, they mean much the same thing. 2 planets are co-present just if they're in the same sign. So if 2 planets are in Scorpio, those planets are co-present. Even if one's at 1 degree of Scorpio and the other's at 29 degrees of Scorpio, those planets are co-present. And then we say conjunction when they're also very close by degree. So if they're at 5 Scorpio and 7 Scorpio, we would say those planets are also conjunct. Okay, so the planets that are in the same sign, we also talked about how a lot of the meanings of these aspects also have to do with what the planets share in common, right? So planets that are in the same sign obviously share everything in common, right? If they're both in Scorpio, they're both in a fixed sign, obviously, they're both in a water sign, obviously, because they're in the same sign. And now the conjunction aspect is very strong. So planets that are conjunct or even just co-present, they'll share a lot of their significations and they'll really influence each other a lot. But the conjunction doesn't really shade towards like friendlier or more difficult. You just get kind of the most raw, direct relationship between those planets. Whether that's friendly or unfriendly or whatever, it just has to be determined by the nature of the planets, as well as what sign they're in and what house they're in and all the other factors as well. All right, then the sextile aspect, right? So this, you can see in the diagram on the right, just an example of, I just use Mercury as an example planet. And then you can see that, a sign right on either side of Mercury, there'll be no aspect relationship there. But then a planet that's in the sign, that's 2 signs for Mercury, or is 11 signs for Mercury. So it's, 2 signs away in either direction. That would be a sextile aspect. And so, right, so it divides 360 by 6, right, because this is like the 60-degree aspect. And so planets that are sextile to each other just share polarity. So they're either both in day signs, diurnal signs, or both in nocturnal signs. But they don't share their element or their quadruplicity. So there is a connection, and they do have something in common, but it's not particularly strong. And as we saw in the 4th class, we can also associate the aspects with the natures of different planets. So the sextile is associated with Venus, who is the lesser benefic. So the sextile is generally friendly, though it's the weakest of the aspects. All right, then we have the square aspect, and so you can see that if Mercury is here, a planet that's in this sign, the 4 houses relative to 4 signs relative to Mercury, or 10 signs relative to Mercury, so 4 away in either direction, the Mercury would be square to a planet there or there. So the square, obviously divides the circle into 4 pieces, right? It's the 90-degree aspect, and 360 divided by 4, or 360 divided by 90 is 4. So planets that are square to each other, they share their quadruplicity. So, if Mercury was in a cardinal sign here, any planet that Mercury was square to would also be a cardinal sign. If Mercury's in a mutable sign, any planet that Mercury would be square to is also mutable. And as we saw, the square has some of the nature of Mars. So there's some conflict and some friction between the planets. And one way of thinking about that also is that because the planets that are in the same quadruplicity talks about like some of the nature of the way that the planet acts, right? A planet in a cardinal sign is like getting things started and getting things moving. So 2 planets that are both in the same quadruplicity are kind of like getting in each other's way a little bit. They're trying to do the same thing, but in different ways, right? They're going to be in signs of not just different elements, but also different polarities. So they're trying to do the same thing, but in different ways, and they kind of step on each other's toes. That's another way of thinking about the square. All right, and then the trine, this is the division of the circle into 3. So it's the 120-degree aspect, and 120 divides 360 into 3 parts. And so the trine, planets that are trine, they share the same element, right? So if Mercury here is in a water sign, any other planet, like if Mercury was in Scorpio here, any planet in Pisces or in Cancer would be trine to Mercury. And so that would be a harmonious and strong connection. They're in signs of the same element, and so they agree and get along well. And the trine shares the nature of Jupiter, and Jupiter is the greater benefic. So this is strong and friendly and cooperative. Then you have the opposition, which is planets that are literally opposite each other. So also called the diameter aspect in traditional texts. And this is the 180-degree aspect, which just divides the circle in half. And so the planets are literally opposite each other, and a lot of the meaning here just comes from that idea of opposition and of being in, as we saw with the signs, opposite signs often have opposite meanings and opposite significations. So planets that are in opposite signs are kind of oriented in opposite directions. And so although they have a fairly strong connection to each other, they're pulling against each other. And that's associated with the nature of Saturn, the greater malefic. All right, and so as we said, planets, aspecting planets, interact with each other and relate to each other, where non-aspecting planets, they don't share anything, and they don't see each other, and they don't interact. The basic nature is determined by the planets themselves, not just like, we can talk about, we talked about this a little bit already, the kind of inherent relationships between the planets, which planets are generally have a friendlier disposition to each other. But we also want to think about the particular condition of planets in a particular chart, right? So sect matters a lot, as we talked about. In a day chart, Jupiter will tend to be the most beneficial planet. So a relationship to Jupiter in a day chart is going to be generally helpful. Whereas Mars, it tends to be the most difficult planet in a day chart. So having an aspect to Mars is going to be more difficult. So you want to filter this stuff through house. Then you also want to think about, or through sect. And you also want to think about other things like house, about dignity. We'll talk a little bit about solar phase or synodic cycles in our last class here. And then also other aspects. If a planet is being really influenced by another planet, that influences that planet and will then change the way that planet relates to other planets, right? So you have to really take in all these different things into consideration when we're thinking about all these relationships and thinking about what sign is the planet in, what house is it in, does the planet agree with sect or not? All that stuff influences the nature of the planets and then influences how they relate to each other. And then, as we said, the aspect nature shades the relationship in one direction or another. Like the trine will tend to shade the relationship towards being friendly and cooperative, where the square will tend to shade the relationship towards being more, more frictive, and there being, kind of some strife. Opposition, the planets will tend to pull in opposite directions, right? So it shades it in different directions. All right, so yeah, that's just a summary of what we've already covered. And so now we're going to add a few extra concepts on top of this. Now, if you're new, this might seem like a lot, and just pick up what you can and pick up some of the basic ideas. So although it might seem like this is adding a lot of complexity, what it'll end up doing is actually really simplifying things, because instead of just having like a whole bunch of planets and a whole bunch of different aspects, what you can really do is start to filter out what's more important and what's less important. And so although there's a bunch of rules that you have to kind of get the hang of and figure out how to work with, once you get some facility with that, it actually really simplifies things, because you can decide what's more important, what's more significant, and more specifically how the different relationships between the planets will go. All right, so here's a nice distinction that I found very useful in reading charts, which is the distinction between superior and inferior aspects. And so the idea is that when planets aspect each other, either by sextile, square, or trine, so not the conjunction and also not the opposition, but the other three aspects, the sextile, square, or trine, the planet that's earlier in zodiacal order is said to be superior to the planet that's later in zodiacal order. So another way you can think about this is that like superiority runs counterclockwise. So I've just got an example chart that I made up there on the right, and the arrows indicate the relationships of superiority. So in this example, Saturn and Taurus here is making a trine to Jupiter and Virgo. And Taurus is earlier in zodiacal order than Virgo is. So Saturn is making the superior trine to Jupiter. And the idea here is that the superior planets tend to have the dominant influence over the inferior planet. So I'll just go through the rest of the examples here. So Jupiter is making a superior trine to Mars, right? So Jupiter tends to have Jupiter tends to influence Mars more than Mars influences Jupiter, right? So the influence tends to flow, not completely, but it tends to flow in the direction from the superior planet to the inferior planet. Now, the place where that talk about earlier and later in zodiacal order gets a little bit confusing is when we have to remember that this is a circle, right? And that it wraps around. So Mars here is in Capricorn, and so Capricorn's obviously earlier in zodiacal order than Pisces, but we also need to get comfortable with the idea that Capricorn is earlier than Aries and also earlier than Taurus. If you think about the wheel like rotating clockwise, the diurnal motion, we can think of what planet would like rise earlier than the other, if that's a helpful way of accessing it. Though again, you can also just remember this as the direction of influence flowing counterclockwise. So in this example, Mars would be making a superior sextile to Mercury, a superior square to Venus, and a superior trine to Saturn. And then Mercury would also be making a superior sextile to Saturn here in this example. So let's see, what else do we have here? So with the conjunction and with the opposition, there's no superior and inferior. Planets that are in the same sign, now obviously literally one would rise a little bit earlier than the other, but for the purposes of the aspects here, we're talking about there's no superior and no inferior when we're talking about conjunctions. And then also with the opposition, if you imagine the chart rotating, we can't say which one rises earlier or later because they're exactly opposite each other. Hopefully that just makes like intuitive sense. So with the opposition, there's no superior and no inferior. And that contributes a little bit to the meaning of the opposition, that neither tends to get the upper hand over the other. And so they just sort of pull against each other. Now, as we talked about with the sextile and with the trine, these relationships are generally friendlier and more cooperative, so it's a little less important. What is going to be a little more important is especially when we're talking about with sect. So, for example, in this chart here, if say this is a day chart, I didn't put the sun and moon in, but yeah, let's say it's a day chart. So Jupiter would be the most beneficial planet. In the chart, if it's a day chart. And so because Jupiter is in the superior position to Mars here, Jupiter would really help out Mars and would like bonify Mars and make Mars more beneficial and really improve its quality. Whereas Jupiter is in the inferior position to Saturn, so Jupiter would have less of an influence over Saturn. So Mars in this chart would benefit more from the relationship to Jupiter, and Saturn would not benefit as much. So a superior aspect from the benefics are beneficial, whereas superior aspects from the malefic are harmful or detrimental. And then inferior aspects, you still have the same basic quality, but it's just less significant. Let's see, Kristen's asking a question. Does that mean that Venus is in less of a detriment in Aries because Mars is superior in the trine? But if Mars was squared, it would be more of a detriment. Let's see, so in this chart here, this is a square coming from Mars. So Mars is making an overcoming square to Venus here. And so this is, that's not good for Venus. That's a condition of difficulty because Mars is in the superior position. And so, yeah, as I was starting to say a second ago with the sextile and the trine tend to be more friendly and more cooperative, but with the square, because with the opposition, nobody really gets the upper hand over the other. But with the square, one planet does get the upper hand. So the planet that's earlier in zodiacal order in terms of a square will tend to dominate over the inferior planet. So yeah, in this chart here, Mars would kind of dominate over Venus, which is going to be hard for Venus. And so again, whether that's a positive or a negative thing depends on the nature of the planets. Having the benefic, especially the benefic that matches the sect, right? So Jupiter in a day chart or Venus in a night chart. If that planet is in a superior square to another, that actually really improves the nature of that other planet. So it all depends on their nature. But whoever's earlier in zodiacal order in that square will tend to dominate over the planet that's in the inferior end of the square. So yeah, it's especially important with squares, though you do also see it with the sextile and the trine. All right, and then, again, we've been talking about aspects in terms of whole signs, but we also want to take the degree-based aspects, the actual angle between the planets, and we do want to take that into account as well. So in general, the degree-based aspects will add detail and indicate priority when reading charts. So planets that the aspect is close by degree, that relationship will tend to be stronger and more significant. So this is another way that we can we can work on filtering out our information and deciding what's more important to look at than other things. We definitely want to put more weight and more priority on aspects that are close by degree as opposed to aspects that are further by degree. So now, if any of you are familiar with, and I'm sure most of you have some basic familiarity with modern astrology, and there's a concept of orbs in modern astrology, which is basically the sort of degree, the range that a planet can be, that an aspect can be away from exact and still count as that aspect. Now, in traditional astrology, there's this idea of orbs isn't really present. For different techniques and different conditions, they'll often say that an aspect needs to be within 3 degrees or within 7 degrees. They'll give different degree ranges, ranges of tolerance for different conditions, but there's no singular topic or singular idea of orbs like there is in modern astrology. And if you read different modern astrological texts, you'll often see that the orbs will vary a lot. Sometimes people will give different orbs for different aspects and also for different planets, but different authors disagree. And I think the easy way to cut through some of that difficulty is just to think that there's no exact cutoff. It's not that if it's 5.5 degrees from being exact, there's no aspect. But if it's 4.5 degrees or 5 degrees, then there's an aspect. There's no hard dividing line, but rather the closer it is, the stronger it is, and then the further away, the weaker it is. So anytime you're defining an orb, I tend to think of that as a fairly arbitrary guide a fairly arbitrary dividing line for something that's actually more of a continuum and more of a continuously variable phenomenon, though we can use them as rough guides for understanding how significant different aspects are going to be. So again, just to flesh that out a little bit, so the square, we talked about is a 90-degree aspect. So the idea would be like with a 5-degree orb, that you would say anything from 85 degrees up to 95 degrees counts as a square, because that's anything within 5 degrees of being a 90-degree aspect, right? So that would be like a 5-degree orb. Now the moon, and this is true in both modern and traditional astrology, because of the moon moves so quickly, approximately 13 degrees per day. It varies a little because of the ellipticity of her orbit and some other things. But about 13 degrees per day, because the moon moves so quickly, she's generally given a wider orb and makes aspects in a broader and wider range than the other planets, because she moves so fast and connects to any planet that she's getting further away from. She was just close to that planet very recently, and any planet that she's approaching, she'll be there very soon. So she makes a wider orb, and the moon is also very sensitive and very receptive to other influences. So we want to give the moon a wider range of degree-based aspects when we're considering this. All right, now, and I'll show you an example of this next thing. There's an example, and we'll look at Jack Parsons' chart again briefly. There's an example in his chart of this. Occasionally, and you'll see this especially with the moon, degree-based aspects and sign-based aspects will sort of disagree with each other, and this will indicate kind of a mixed situation. So by whole sign aspects, you could have, we'll see this in, actually, I'll just jump ahead and show you right now instead of trying to explain this. So yeah, here's Jack Parsons' chart here. And so you see his moon is at 27 degrees of Pisces, and his Saturn is at 2 degrees of Cancer. So they're both in water signs. So by whole sign aspects, this is a trine, right? Because they're in two signs of the same element. So it's a trine by whole signs. But what we notice is by degree, they're only separated by, 95 degrees, right? So they're 95 degrees apart. So they're only 5 degrees away from being a square. And the moon is moving very quickly, right? So the moon will be to make that square exact, the moon will have to get to 2 degrees Aries, and then she'll be exactly square to Saturn and Cancer. And that'll only take the moon about 10 hours to get to 2 degrees Aries. So very soon, the moon's going to make an exact square to Saturn. So in this relationship here, there's some of the nature of a trine as well as some of the nature of a square. So, and this will happen especially with the moon because of her speed, but you will get these slightly mixed cases, and it just means that the situation is mixed. It's not as extreme as it's not as extremely beneficial like it would be with a trine, and it's not as extremely difficult as it would be with a square. It's somewhere in the middle. There's a certain amount of cooperation, but also a certain amount of difficulty and friction. So that's just something to be aware of. All right, and then I just gave you just rough. Again, I think it's much more useful to think of this as a continuum and as a continuously varying phenomenon. But just some rough guides here. Any aspects that are within 3 degrees of being exact are very close and very significant, and should definitely figure quite prominently in your reading of a chart. You definitely want to pay a lot of attention to that. That's going to be important. Within 7 degrees is still going to be significant. And then once you get past 7 degrees, they start being a little less important. And then, except with the moon makes important aspects out to 13 degrees. And again, this is more about determining priority and what you want to pay attention to. Is you just want to pay attention to the earlier stuff, and then also talk about just how close the relationship between those planets is. If a planet is separated by just a degree, 2 or 3 from an exact aspect, those planets have a close relationship, and that'll be important. And then the further away they get, it just becomes less of a close relationship and less important. All right, and then our last concept here. Now, we're not going to fully go into this because it gets a little bit complicated, but I just want to introduce you to the idea here because it is another one that's very helpful to take into consideration, and can help to filter out which aspects are more important to pay attention to and which ones are less important when you're reading a chart. And that's the distinction between applying and separating. The basic idea here is that an applying aspect is in the process of moving towards the exact aspect. So they're in the process of getting, they're in the process of being separated by, or the aspect is getting closer to being exact. Whereas with a separating aspect, the aspect was exact and now is getting further away. So again, we think about this in terms of time, like with a square. The exact square is 90 degrees. So if the planets are currently 93 degrees apart, and then tomorrow they'll be 94 degrees apart, and then the day after that they'll be 95 degrees apart, they're in the process of becoming less square to each other. So the aspect is separating. They're becoming less close by degree. And so that would be a separating aspect and would be less important. Whereas planets that are on the way towards making that exact aspect, that would be an applying aspect. And I'll show you a couple of examples of this in Jack's chart in just a second to make this a little bit clearer. So in natal charts, you can use applying and separating just to filter out which ones are more important. Applying aspects are stronger and more important. Separating aspects are weaker and less important. In like electional and horary astrology, applying aspects often indicate the future and things that are going to happen, and separating aspects often indicate the past and things that have already happened. But in natal charts, it's more just about strength and priority. Usually you can determine what's an applying and a separating aspect just by looking at which planet is faster. You just want to know how their relative speeds are to each other to determine whether they're getting closer or further apart, or whether the aspect is getting closer or further apart from being exact. But because of things like retrogrades, and when a planet is about to station retrograde or is just recently stopped being retrograde, that planet will be very slow. So because of that variation in speed and the fact that they occasionally move backwards, that can add complications. So to be really sure about this, you need to use an ephemeris or some software to be able to determine this. And so we're not going to go into all the details about how to do that. I just wanted to introduce you to the idea. All right, so I'll just give you just a couple of examples from Jack's chart, and then we need to move on. So let's see, let's talk about Venus and the moon here. So we see that Venus is at 24 degrees Scorpio, and the moon is at 27 degrees of Pisces. So this is a trine. They're both in water signs here, and they're separated by 3 degrees, right? Venus is at 24, then the moon is at 27. So they're just 3 degrees away from being an exact trine. So this is a close trine, right? It's just 3 degrees from being exact. So it's close and it's significant and it's strong. But it's separating because the moon's at 27 and Venus is at 24. The moon's faster, right? So it's going to take, Venus is only advancing by, maybe a degree every day or so, anyways, we won't get into too many details of that. But the moon is moving much faster. The moon moves, like 12 times faster than Venus. Again, her speed Venus's speed varies, but in general, the moon moves much faster than, or the moon always moves much faster than Venus. So the moon's going to get further and further from this exact trine. So it's a separating trine. With Mercury and Mars here, we see Mercury at 1 degree of Scorpio and Mars at 2 degrees of Scorpio. And because Mercury is faster than Mars, we know that Mercury is about to make an exact conjunction with Mars. Right, Mercury is getting closer and closer because Mercury is faster. Mercury is getting closer and closer to Mars here in this example. So that's an applying conjunction, right? So this is it's only a degree apart, and it's applying, and the conjunction is strong anyway. So that's a very strong and very significant relationship between Mercury and Mars. Whereas if it was the other way around, if Mars was at 1 degree and Mercury was at 2 degrees, then Mercury would be past Mars and getting further from Mars. And so it would be less strong and less important. And we can also see, just get a couple examples of superior and inferior here. So this is a night chart. So we know that Venus is going to be the most beneficial planet in the chart. And so we can look at what other planets she benefits the most. So she's co-present with both Mercury and Mars. So she's going to have a strong beneficial relationship to both Mercury and to Mars. So the condition of both Mercury and Mars will be improved by their relationship to Venus. Now, Venus is also making a superior square to Jupiter. It's not extremely close by degree, right? Venus is at 24 degrees and Jupiter's at 12. So that square is separated by 12 degrees. So it's not particularly strong, but Venus is in the superior position. So this helps Jupiter and improves Jupiter's condition here because Venus is in the superior condition. And then, as we said, there's this trine that Venus is making to the moon, and it's only separated by 3 degrees, so it's strong. The trine is friendly and beneficial, and Venus is in the superior position, and she's the benefic of the sect, so this really improves the moon's condition a lot. If it was an applying aspect, it would be even better, but this is still quite strong and will be very beneficial for the moon. And as we already I already used this example of the square from Saturn to the Sun in one of our previous classes. And one of the things I was getting a little ahead of myself with there was that Saturn is in the superior position. So Saturn is dominating over the Sun and has a dominant influence over the Sun. And that's some of where I was drawing my delineation of that from, was the fact that I knew that, even though we hadn't introduced that concept yet. Yeah, and there's other aspects in this chart as well that you can take a look at. And if we have time in our next class, we'll come back and look at Jack's chart again. All right, but yeah, let's switch gears here and flesh out the meanings of the houses. This will be the last major component of astrology for our series here today, and is the last of the 4 primary components of astrology, right? Planets, signs, houses, and aspects are the 4 main components of the horoscopic horoscopic astrology. So this will be our last main piece here. So where the signs were a 12-fold division of the ecliptic, the houses are a division of the sky. So, everywhere in the world right now, the planets are in the same signs, right? Venus is in, let's do the sun is in, 5 degrees of Taurus today, maybe 6 degrees. Let's just say 5 degrees, right? So the sun is at 5 degrees of Taurus everywhere in the world today. That's the same, no matter where on the planet you are. But obviously, where the sun is in the sky is not the same in different parts of the planet. Here, in California, it's a little afternoon, so the sun's, high and towards the middle of the sky, whereas on the opposite side of the globe, it's the middle of the night. And so the sun is going to be in different houses depending, both on, and this varies and changes throughout the course of the day as the planets rise and culminate and then set again. They change houses quickly. And it also varies by location. A baby born, right now in California is going to have a pretty different chart than a baby born right now in Tokyo. Although their planets will be at the same degrees of the same signs, and they'll be the same aspects will obtain between the planets. They'll all be in different houses, and so you'll have different planets ruling the different houses. And so those 2 babies will have very different birth charts, even though they were born at the same moment. So the houses are divisions of the sky relative to the particular time and the place, and they also signify different areas of life. So kind of like we've done with previous things, we'll build up some of the basic concepts that go into to determining what the houses mean, and then we'll go through all 12 of the houses. All right, so our first distinction here is the houses that are above the horizon and below the horizon. So the red line you're seeing there is the horizon. So the first house, as we've already talked about a little bit, that's the rising sign. That's the sign of the zodiac that's currently in the process of rising up over the eastern horizon. And then the 7th house is the sign of the zodiac that's setting over the western horizon. And, as we've already talked about here, I'm using whole sign houses. There are other ways of dividing up the sky into 12 sections. This is one, and I think one of the foundational ways of doing this, though I don't use it as I've talked about before, I actually use multiple house systems. I just use the whole sign house system as the kind of the basis or the foundation. And then later you can look at what other house systems also have to say about a chart as like a secondary overlay. But this is one of the core ways of accessing the house meanings. And as we'll see, some of the meanings of the houses are definitely related to the whole sign logic. So the houses are entire signs. So whatever house is rising up over the eastern horizon, that entire sign is the first house. And then they just follow in order of rising. So the second house will be the next sign that will rise up over the eastern horizon. It'll be the next one in order. Then the third sign will rise after that, then the fourth, then the fifth, and so on. So we can get some associations here between just the difference between something being above ground and being below ground. So the upper portion of the chart, like a planet that's above the ground, a planet that's in that upper portion of the chart is above the horizon. And the upper portion of the chart, the portion above the horizon, is associated with the sun, it's associated with the day, it's associated with light, with spirit, with public matters, with things like career and the work in the world. And it's also associated with the concept of the daimon. Daimon, often translated as spirit, like a spirit. It's a little bit like the modern concept of the holy guardian angel. It's a kind of guardian spirit, or a spirit that looks after you and ensures that you fulfill your fate. So that's associated with the upper region of the chart. And then, actually, I'll jump down to the third bullet point here. The lower portion of the chart, the portion that's below the horizon, is associated with the moon, with night, with darkness, with the body, with private and secret matters, and also with the idea of fortune. So fortune, like in Hellenistic astrology, was contrasted with the daimon. And so fortune is things that happen to you, whether for good or for ill. It's like fortune. It has some of the ideas of like luck, things that maybe, I think you know what I'm talking about there. All right, and then in the middle here, we're talking about the first house as well as the seventh house. Though, as we'll see, the seventh house gets a lot of its meanings just by being opposite to the first house. So this is most significant for the first house here. The first house in whole sign houses is partially above the horizon and partially below the horizon, right? Because whatever the sign is that is the first house is in the process of rising up above the horizon. So it's partially above and partially below. And so this symbolizes the meeting of spirit and body. And as we'll see, the first house represents, in a natal chart, the first house represents you yourself, because you yourself are the meeting of the soul and the body. And the moment of birth was thought to be the moment when the soul enters the body. And then, so the moment that those two things are wedded is the moment of birth. And so the sign that is straddling that division between the above ground and the below ground, that represents you, the soul entering the body, and your life beginning. All right, so the next concept we have to get in here is the other. So we've already talked about the ascendant and the descendant, right? That's the place where the ecliptic, the ascendant, right, is the point where the ecliptic intersects the horizon on the eastern side, not always due east, but towards the east. And then the descendant is where the ecliptic intersects the horizon on the west. And because the diurnal motion is a clockwise rotation, right? That's why things are rising up over the eastern horizon and then setting on the western horizon. But then we also have another pair of axes here. This is what's called the midheaven, or the medium quelli, which literally means like middle of the heaven, also known as the MC. And then opposite to the MC, we have the imum quelli, which is like the imum means like bottom, or like the low point. So this is like the bottom of the sky, also known as the IC. So the MC is always, for the northern hemisphere, the MC is always due south, and the IC is always due north. The MC is always above ground, and then for the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. The MC is obviously always above ground, and the IC is always below ground. And so, although the MC and IC is always the due north-south, the ascendant and descendant are not always, due east and west, and even not usually due east and west. And so, the way that we orient our charts, we always put the ascendant, like on the middle, in the left portion of the chart. And so you'll see the MC in whole sign houses will not always be in the 10th house. It'll be kind of angled one way or another. And I'll show you an example of that later. And we'll see that in Jack's chart as well. It's not really the MC that's moving. It's just that it's in a different position relative to the ascendant. So the angles themselves, the ascendant, the MC, the IC, and the descendant, those angles are really important critical points in a chart. And so a planet that's close to the angles is strong and prominent. And as we'll see, the houses associated with those angles are signify really core areas of life. And then the other houses, the ones that aren't just angular, right? So those houses, the first house, the fourth house, the seventh house, and the 10th house, those are the angular houses. And then the other houses are named by their relationship to the angles. So the succeeding houses are the houses that are approaching the angle, right? So the second house will be the next sign to rise. So the second house is approaching the ascendant. The fifth house is approaching the IC. The eighth house is approaching the descendant. And then the 11th house is approaching the midheaven. And the cadent houses are falling away from the angles. So the 12th house is like moving away from the ascendant. The third house is moving away from the IC. The sixth house is moving away from the descendant. And the ninth house is moving away from the midheaven. And as I said, the MC and IC won't always be in the 10th and the 4th, and we'll talk about what that means when that happens, which is pretty common at the end of the class today. And one other thing to know here is that a planet that's on the MC is at its highest point for that day. It's not necessarily the highest planet in the sky, but it's the highest that planet will reach for that day. And so the MC is going to be associated with prominence and with being like at the height of it. A planet on the MC is like at the height of its power. All right, and so one way that you can access this, because this can be kind of hard to get like an intuitive grasp of, one way that you can access this is if you're familiar with doing Liber Resh. So when you do Liber Resh at the 4 stations of the sun is conjoined one of the, if you're doing it right on the moment, the sun is conjoined one of the angles at that moment. So at dawn, the sun is conjoined the ascendant, right? Because the sun is right on the eastern horizon at dawn. And then obviously at sunset, the sun is right on the western horizon. That's what sunset is. At solar noon, the sun is exactly halfway through its course for that day, and the sun is at the highest point that it will be at that day. And so the sun is conjoined the midheaven, or conjoined the MC at solar noon. And then at solar midnight, the sun is conjoined the IC. Again, this won't always be in the 4th and the 10th house, but solar noon is always when the sun is on the MC, and solar midnight is when the sun is on the IC. And so one of the things that's happening here, although these are like nice sort of symbolic stations of the sun, the 4 like main transition points throughout the day, right? The sun's rising, the sun is culminating, the sun is setting, and then anti-culminating at midnight. The being conjoined one of the angles also makes the sun strong and prominent at that moment, and so you're tapping into that heightened solar power at that moment when you're doing Liber Resh. And so this is one reason why doing Liber Resh very close to the actual moment of dawn or solar noon or sunset or solar midnight is a good idea, because you can take advantage of that magnified solar power. And of course, this applies to the other planets as well. I was just giving you this as an example. All right, so a little bit more about these angular triads. So these 3 things that the houses are divided into, cadent, angular, and succedent. These triads are best thought of as being grouped around the angles. So we have 4 triads of a cadent, angular, and succedent houses. So we can see that there's a triad group. The 12th, 1st, and 2nd is the triad grouped around the ascendant. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th is the triad grouped around the 4th. 6th, 7th, and 8th is grouped around the angle of the 7th. And then the 9th, 10th, and 11th is like grouped around the 10th, right? So the angles are like the middle of each one of the triads. And then the succedent is approaching and rising up to that angle. And then the cadent is like falling away from that angle. So the cadent houses, these are the ones that are no longer angular. They were recently angular and now are moving away from being angular. So they're like past the peak of their prominence. They're like they're also called declining houses. So they're declining from prominence. and they're falling away from the angle. And the cadent houses tend to signify things like problem solving and maintenance. And planets in cadent houses are weaker and less energetic. You can think of them as having just sort of recently done a lot of work, and now they're a little like tired. They're kind of in a recovery sort of state. So they're less energetic and less able to get things done. The angular houses, as we'll see, will signify really core life topics, right? The first house signifies the self, the fourth house is home, the seventh house is like the other, and the 10th house is like career or the work in the world. So really core life topics are associated with the angular houses. And planets in the angular houses, planets in the first, fourth, seventh, or 10th, are very strong and very prominent. And then the succedent houses, these are the houses that are rising up to the angle. They tend to signify support and resources because they're like approaching the angle, and so they're kind of supporting whatever's going on at that angle. And then planets here are moderately strong, somewhere between angular and the cadent, right? It's like a mid-level of strength. All right, next we can also talk about the aspects, because again, the ascendant is like the anchor point for a lot of this stuff. One of the things we're interested in is what the relationship that the other houses bear to the ascendant. So using the ascendant here as the reference point. So the third house and the 11th house are sextile to the ascendant. The 4th and the 10th are square to the ascendant. The 5th and the 9th are trine to the ascendant. And then the 7th is opposite to the ascendant. And so those aspects will really color the meanings and the nature of those houses. Like as we'll see, the 5th house and the 9th house, although they're not the strongest houses, planets in the 5th and the 9th tend to be very supportive and beneficial because they're making like a trine to the ascendant. So they have that trine relationship to you yourself. So planets in the 5th and the 9th tend to be favorable. So if you have like a benefic in the 5th or the 9th, it's extra good. And a malefic in the 5th or the 9th tends to be more favorable than it otherwise would be. And then what we also have is the 2nd, 6th, 8th, and 12th houses. These are what are called the dark houses, and they don't make an aspect to the ascendant. And so the dark houses, they don't see and they don't aspect the ascendant. And so planets in the dark houses, these planets will be a little bit hidden. They will have less, they'll be not very prominent in the life, or they'll be kind of hidden and out of view. Whereas like a planet that's in the first house, a planet in the ascendant will often be very kind of obvious in someone's life. A planet in one of the dark houses will be less obvious and more secret. And as we'll see, especially the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses also signify some of the more difficult life topics. All right, so I introduced this concept of these like, again, sort of quoting Ben Dykes here, of calling these things Hermetic mandalas. So we already talked about the thema mundi. That's where we derived the basic scheme of the rulerships of the signs. And we also talked about the exaltations, the signs that the planets are exalted in. And so now we can talk about the third one of these things, the planetary joys. And so as you can already see, the thema mundi and the exaltations are related to the planets and the signs, whereas the planetary joys are related to the houses. All right, so here's the planetary joys. I filled in, I sort of colored it in to show you the above and below the horizon. That's not normally like a part of the planetary joys scheme. I just filled it in to make part of what's happening here a little bit more obvious. So so we've got each one of the planets here is in the joys scheme is associated with one of the houses. And so maybe this already jumps out to a few of you. One of the most obvious, there's a bunch of, again, like with the other ones, there's a lot of really interesting things happening here, and there's interesting relationships between like this scheme and the other two mandalas as well, but we don't have time to go into all here. But it's worth spending some time with, but I'll just lay out a couple of the really basic things. So yeah, one thing that might be obvious here is that the 3 planets that are associated with the day, that's the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, those 3 planets are above the horizon here in this diagram. And the 3 planets associated with the night, the Moon, Venus, and Mars, are below the horizon. So you see that association of above and below the horizon with day and night, and with light and darkness. And then Mercury, who's not associated with either the day or the night, but can sort of move between. And especially, we think of Hermes in Greek mythology, who's moving from Olympus to our world, down into Hades, and then returning again. He's like crossing back and forth between the above and the below. Mercury is associated with the first house, which again, as we said, straddles the above the horizon. Part of it's above the horizon and part of it's below the horizon. So that's why Mercury gets filled in there. We'll also notice that the sun and moon the two luminaries are directly opposite to each other in the 3rd and the 9th. The two benefic planets are opposite each other in the 5th and the 11th. And then the two malefics are opposite each other in the 6th and the 12th. So that's another interesting thing to think about and is part of the basic arrangement here going on. So the main thing the main significance of this is just that the meanings of the houses here are going to be colored by the planet associated with them. So the 3rd house will take on a lunar quality, the 5th house will take on a Venusian quality, and that'll color the meanings of the signs. A planet that's actually in the house that is that planet's joy. It's not quite the same thing as like a planet being like in the sign of its rulership. It doesn't necessarily make the planet like stronger, but it does show that planet will be doing a job. As we'll see, the houses are associated with like different areas of life, and so that planet will show up in an area of life that they're particularly well suited to. Like as we'll see, the 5th house is associated with children, with sexuality, with creativity and the arts, with the enjoyment and recreation. And so having Venus in the 5th house means that Venus is involved in those activities, and she's very well suited to those activities. But again, the main thing we're doing is just using this as a way of deriving meanings for the houses based on which planet is found there in the planetary joys diagram. All right, and then the last thing here, similar to some of the logic that we saw with the signs of the zodiac, houses that are opposite to each other are in part defined by the house that's opposite to them. Again, some of this logic of opposition. And so we also see that for all but the 1st and 7th, which are partially above and partially below, this also overlaps with some of the above and below symbolism, above and below the horizon symbolism, right? So the 6th house, the 2nd house and the 8th house are opposite to each other, and so they have related but contrasting meanings. And part of the contrast is that the 2nd house is below the horizon and the 8th house is above the horizon, and we'll see that as we go through. Now, if you're newer to this, just don't worry about this next point. But it is something that I found helpful to think about. Is that although planets most strongly influence the house that they're actually located within, you can sometimes also see influence in the opposite house as well. So if you have a planet in the 3rd house, that planet will most show up in like 3rd house topics, but you may also see it in 9th house topics as well. And again, it's just some of this this connection between things that are opposite each other. Yeah, and we'll see that the opposite logic as we go through the houses here. All right, so this is kind of a messy and not the prettiest diagram here, but just sort of combining a bunch of the things we've done in the last 6 or 7 slides. So when we're looking at what a house means, the basic questions here that we're going to ask are like, where in the sky is it, right? Is it above the horizon? Is it below the horizon? Is it just coming up over the eastern horizon? Is it approaching the western horizon? Where is it in the sky? Does it aspect, or see the ascendant? And if so, which aspect does it see the ascendant from? Then we're going to ask if the house is it angular or cadent or succedent? And if it is cadent or succedent, which angle is it either falling away from if it's cadent or rising up to if it's succedent? Then we'll also ask which planet, if any, has their joy in that house. And then we'll also ask which house is opposite to that house. And so this will be the basic way that we'll build up the meanings of the houses. All right, so yeah, let's just try to move through the basic significations of the 12 houses. Again, these are just to sort of get you started thinking. You definitely want to look at other sources and other people's opinions and things like that. And this varies a little bit with tradition, and some of this stuff is definitely culturally relative as well. So all good stuff to keep in mind. And again, I think a lot of this is in the nature of archetypes, where it can be difficult to say exactly directly what the different houses signify. But as we'll see, they all kind of cluster around some core ideas. All right, so the first house, as we said, is the joy of Mercury. And in Hellenistic astrology, the first house was known as the helm, right? So like the helm of a ship, the place that the ship is like steered from. Now the ascendant, yeah, so the ascendant is always located in the first house, right? That's what makes the first house the first house. It's whatever sign the ascendant is located in. The first house is an angular house, and it's the eastern horizon, the place where the ecliptic intersects the eastern horizon, and it's partially above ground and partially below ground. And so, as I was already saying, the birth is associated with rising up over the eastern horizon, and especially in the classical world, it was thought that the soul came to indwell the body at the moment of birth, which I assume, I've never actually seen this directly stated, but I assume had something to do with the association of spirit with breath, because obviously it's not until you're born that you actually start breathing. So once you start breathing, that's like the moment that the soul indwells the body. And a metaphor that was used both in and out of the astrological tradition, a metaphor that was used here was like the construction of a ship. So the fetus developing in the womb is like a ship that's in the process of being built. And then at the moment of birth, that's the moment that the captain steps onto the ship. So that's like the soul is like the captain that steps onto the ship at the moment of birth. And so that's the moment when spirit and body, or when the soul and the body come together. And that's most symbolized by the first house. So the first house symbolizes you yourself at the moment of birth, and it is the core thing in the chart that symbolizes you. So yeah, like we've been saying, the significations of the first house are birth, ensoulment, life, self, both body and soul, that health, both like the physical health as well as mental health, and the mind. So again, the first house signifies both body and soul, both the body and mind, right? Because it's that uniting the above the horizon and the below the horizon. The appearance, as well as the physical appearance, as well as the basic like character and demeanor and the manner of a person, that's all associated with the first house. So just quick here. So the ascendant and as well as the planet that rules the ascendant in a natal chart is probably the most important thing, at least from a more traditional perspective. Modern astrology tends to put a lot of sometimes weight like the sun sign higher than the ascendant, but more traditionally the ascendant would have been the most important. So when you're reading a natal chart, you can ask, which sign is in the first house? Like in Jack Parsons' chart, he has Gemini rising. So Gemini is the first house. So just significations of Gemini are going to be important for who he is. But we also want to ask which planet rules the first house, right? So Gemini is ruled by Mercury. So Mercury is his ascendant lord. So not just is he like a Gemini sort of person, but in particular, he's a mercurial sort of person. Then we also want to ask which sign the ascendant lord is located in, right? So in Jack's chart, Mercury was in Scorpio. So not only is Gemini important for who he is, but Scorpio is important for who he is as well, because that's where his ascendant lord is found. And then, of course, we would also want to, look at what else is going on in that sign. Like in Jack's chart, Mars is right there and is really, really close to Mercury. So, that he'll take on a lot of that martial quality as well. And his mercurial nature will be really colored by Mars. Right, so which sign is the ascendant lord found in, and also, what else is going on inside of that sign, but also what house is the ascendant lord found in. This is I found really helpful in reading birth charts, is just looking at what house the ascendant lord is found in. You'll often find that people have like an orientation towards that aspect of life. whatever area of life is signified by the house that the ascendant lord is located in, there'll often be an orientation towards those sorts of topics in the person's life. Let's see, you also asked what other planets are in the first house, because those will all color the first house topics. And then we can also look at any planets that are making like close aspects to the actual degree of the ascendant. Those are all helpful things in some really basic first steps in reading a natal chart. All right, now from here we'll just go a little bit quicker through the other 11 houses. All right, so the second house, this is a succeedent house, which is rising up to the first house. So it'll be the next sign. Once the sign that's currently rising is now entirely above the horizon, the planet that is now the second house will become the first house. So it's succeedent, it's the next rising sign. It's a dark house. It doesn't make a whole sign aspect to the first house, and it's also below ground. And so we see some of this idea of things that support the first house topics, things that support you and your life. And so significations in the second house are substance and survival, resources, livelihood, money, finances, income, and also possessions. Now I said movable possessions. This wouldn't include things like property or houses, like a house that you own or something like that. That would not be in the second house. The second house would be, if you were moving, anything that you put in the moving truck and take with you, all those types of possessions would be like the second stuff in the second house. Finances, of course, and finances and money are the big, like, classic topics for second house things, and that's certainly like one of the main places you look when looking at issues related to finances and money and livelihood, but also, substance and the basic resources needed for survival are all associated with the second house. All right, then the third house. The third house is the joy of the moon, and in Hellenistic astrology, because that is associated with the moon, the third house was called the house of goddess, or the house of the goddess. So the third house is a cadent house and is declining from the fourth house. The third house is below ground, and it's making an inferior sextile to the ascendant. Right, again, going back to that inferior and superior logic that's even seen in the houses as well. So significations of the third house. The third house has a big and sometimes confusing list of significations. I probably struggled more with getting a sense of the third house than any of the others in my astrological studies. So yeah, just be aware that there's a lot of stuff associated with the third house, and it's really worth, I think, thinking about how these things are connected and how the different things like fit together with the core symbolism. But yes, in general, significations of the third house include the local environment, habits, routines, your kind of local neighborhood, like a commute to work, or like routine trips, like going to the grocery store every week and stuff like that. Those are all very like third house sort of things. Local environment, habits, routines, short distance travel. Also communication and writing are all associated, in language and expression are all associated with the third house. Siblings are traditionally associated with the third house, as well as primary education. And then I think, so in Hellenistic astrology, the third house was often associated with like local deities and like the cults of local deities, in opposition to the ninth house, which is often associated with the bigger, like more national cults. But I think obviously that doesn't really make a lot of sense for our contemporary culture, but we could think of it as more like personal spirituality, as opposed to something a little bit more public or a little bit more prominent. Yeah, personal spirituality or spirituality oriented towards like a smaller, more private, or more local like group of people. All right, the fourth house. The fourth house is an angular house, right? So this is associated with the bottom angle and the lower heaven, or the lower portion of the ecliptic, right? So fourth house is an angular house, and it's the bottom of the chart, and it's making an inferior square to the ascendant, and the fourth house is below ground. So significations of the fourth house include foundations, home. Now property, like a land that you own or a house, those are all fourth house things, whether you own it or not. If you're renting or something like that too, that's still your fourth house. You don't necessarily have to own it, but your yeah, your home is definitely associated with the fourth house. And this can include both like the home that you live in now, as well as home in the sense of like where you come from. So the fourth house is also associated with childhood and with the parents, and even with the topic of like ancestors and things like that in general. Yeah, like where you come from is associated with the fourth house. The fourth house, because of its location at the bottom and the lowest portion of the chart, is also associated with like the chthonic, right? The below ground, like even the underworld, is associated with the fourth house. Now, in general, this will show up in more like symbolic sort of ways, though I have occasionally heard of or even seen this being a little bit more literal, and some fourth house things literally being associated with things that are below the ground. The fourth house, because it's the bottom part of the chart and the lowest part of the chart, it's the most hidden and the most private part of the chart. And so it's associated with very hidden, very private, or very personal things, right? And again, that makes sense. I mean, your home is something that is not generally like seen by the world, right? That's your personal space. Yeah, so David's asking, would Pluto in the fourth house point to that chthonic dimension? Yeah, certainly. And that's, yeah, I think that's a really great way of thinking about the significations of things, is when you see like different things starting to line up, like, you know, Pluto is obviously associated with the underworld, and so is the fourth house. So if something associated with the underworld is found in a place that's also associated with the underworld, that'll really, really emphasize that underworld sort of dimension. Yeah, definitely. And you also see in some like traditional texts and things like that, you'll also see like mystical topics being associated with the fourth house. I haven't found that one to be particularly useful, or I haven't really seen that much in charts that I looked at, but it is there in the tradition. But yeah, definitely like home and the foundations, as well as family and childhood. Those are a lot of the really core significations of the fourth house. All right, the fifth house. So the fifth house is the joy of Venus, and is also known as the house of good fortune. And right, which makes sense with Venus being in the house of good fortune. And as we talked about, the fortune and the idea of fortune is associated with the area below the ground, right? So this is the joy of Venus below the ground. So it's the house of good fortune. It's a succeedent house, so it's approaching the fourth house, and it's making an inferior trine to the ascendant. So that, you know, trine is helpful and beneficial, though it's inferior, so it's a little less, a little not quite as strong as the superior trine, which we'll see with the ninth house. And again, as we said, it's below the ground. The fifth house can signify, in general, creative energy. The classic topic for the fifth house is children, which is what you know, a good portion of humanity uses its creative energy for, and, you know, non-human persons and animals and all that as well. They use a lot of their creative energy in producing children and nurturing children and raising children. But, you know, not everyone chooses to have children, and even people who do have children, they have other things that they do with their creative energy as well. So yeah, so children are associated with the fifth house. Also sexuality, all forms of sexuality. Of course, there's obviously the connection to, you know, sexuality being what produces children, but any form of sexuality at all can be associated with the fifth house. And we'll see this is contrasted with like romantic relationships, which we'll see associated with the seventh house. So the fifth house is like sexuality, but not directly related to romantic relationships necessarily. Also enjoyment and pleasure and recreation, all of these things are associated with the fifth house. And then, yeah, again, things that you create, or those things that you use your creative energy to produce, you know, like art or music or any other creative endeavors that you have, those can all be fifth house things. And you'll see, you know, if you look at the charts of artists and things like that, you'll often see connections to the fifth house. Yeah. All right, sixth house. So the sixth house is the joy of Mars. And so where the fifth house associated with Venus was the house of good fortune, the sixth house is the house of bad fortune. Yeah, So the sixth house is a cadent house, so it's falling away from the seventh house. It's a dark house, and it's also below ground. And so we can see how some of the more difficult things are starting to line up here. We have one of the malefic planets, Mars. We have the cadent quality, which is the weaker and more difficult of the part of the angular triad. It's also a dark house, and it's below ground. So we start to have some of these more difficult things starting to stack up here. And so the sixth house is often associated with problem solving. It can be associated with jobs, responsibilities, chores, and maintenance. Now this would be jobs as opposed to like careers, which is a nice helpful distinction. If you have, if you're working some job that has nothing to do with what you actually want to do and actually want to care about, you're literally doing it just to be able to pay the bills and buy food and everything. That's more of a sixth house thing, whereas like a career and something that you're invested in a different way, we'll see that's more of like a 10th house thing. But also just, responsibilities, chores, general maintenance sort of stuff, things you have to do just to maintain, your house or your bodily health. Those are all like sixth house matters. The sixth house can sometimes be associated with physical health challenges. And if you have placements in the sixth house, there's no reason to be like fearful about illness or things like that. But if any kind of like physical health challenges are things that you struggle with, the sixth house would be a place to look for some of the signifiers of what's going on with that. And sometimes, like transits, again, there's no need to be fearful or anything like that, but sometimes sixth house transits can be associated with either like health challenges or just the need to do things to maintain your health. Like maybe, having a sixth house transit and you go like, oh man, I really need to start going to the gym again or something like that. That could be like a sixth house thing. And the gym would be like a sixth house kind of activity, as you're just doing this, kind of maintenance work to keep the body in good functioning, healthy condition. The sixth house is often associated with subordinates and employees, like people that work for you or people that are in some sense subordinate to you, are all associated with the sixth house. And we also see pets and domestic animals associated with the sixth house as well. And again, I think problem solving is a good one for the sixth house as well. If you have like favorable planets or strong planets or important planets in the sixth house, a place that you could look for that is in your ability to solve problems. Having strong things in the sixth house may make you a really effective problem solver. Though again, there may also be some orientation towards some of the challenges that we've been talking about here. I have a cat attacking me from behind. Get out of here. All right, let's just move on here. All right, seventh house. So the seventh house, this is the descendant, and the descendant is in the seventh house. That's the place where the ecliptic crosses the western horizon and the sign that's setting below the horizon. So angular house, western horizon, as you said, partially above and partially below the horizon, and it's opposite to the first house. So now I went through the first 6 without really talking about the opposites, but now as we start to get to houses that are opposite, houses we've already talked about, we can see some of that logic of the opposites. So where the first house is the self, the seventh house opposite to first is the other. So we have this really, just really basic duality of self and other with the first and the seventh. So classically, and often most importantly, the seventh house is associated with like the spouse or with the romantic partner or partners. People engaged in like polyamorous relationships and things like that. You may see some of that in the seventh house. It's not necessarily just one person. Partners of other types as well can be associated with the seventh house, even like business partners, and in things like horary, like asking horary questions or in elections and things like that. The seventh house can just be associated with like the other party in question, or even with like signing contracts and things like that. All that stuff can be associated with the seventh house as well. And other close relationships too. As we'll see, there's another house that's the 11th house can be associated with like friends and acquaintances and social groups, but like really close friendships, people you've been friends with for many years, people that you have a really deep, close relationship with. Those people may be more of like a seventh house relationship. The seventh house can also be close, like personal relationships that are a little bit more difficult. So things like adversaries or people that you're in competition with, that can show up in the seventh house as well. And again, there's some of that logic of like the opposition, because the thing that's like opposite to the first house is like something that you're sort of opposed to or in competition with. And again, you know, what things show with a planet like in a house, you may see it showing up in you may get multiple of these things. Like you may see some of the same signifiers in like the spouse, some of the same like qualities in a spouse that you also have with other people that you have close relationships with. And which planets are there will often shape things one way or the other. You know, having like Mars in the seventh house, you know, might predispose someone to having this sort of like competitive relationships with others, whereas Venus in the seventh house would, you know, maybe lean more towards, you know, like friendlier relationships with others. Though again, you'll often see multiple like overlapping things at the same time. And having a difficult planet here doesn't mean that you're going to be single forever or that all your relationships will fail or anything like that. It can just show like some struggle. And you know, a concept from traditional astrology as well is that not all the houses, then there's some complex like timing techniques to work through this, but not all the houses are activated at all times. So just because you have like a difficult planet in the seventh doesn't mean that your relationships are always going to be bad or something like that. But when that planet is activated or that house is activated, it may indicate challenges in the seventh house. And again, this can be both your relationship to those others as well as those other people themselves. This is, you know, more of a little bit of a traditional perspective rather than the more modern psychological perspective. If you're in a relationship and there's like a difficult transit to the seventh house, you know, that could indicate some trouble in the relationship, though it could also just indicate that the person that you're having the relationship with, that person goes through something difficult. You know, maybe your spouse is having a really hard time at work or is struggling in some area of their life. It doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship is in trouble. It may just be the other person that you're in the relationship with that is having some trouble. Yeah, I think that's enough about the seventh house. All right, eighth house here. So eighth house is a succeeding house. It's approaching the seventh. It's another dark house, so no whole sign aspect to the ascendant. It's above ground, and it's opposite to the second house. So where the second house was like your resources and your money, the eighth house is often other people's resources and other people's money or possessions. Constantly, this could also be like the partner's possessions. So it could be like your partner's finances would show up in the seventh house. Again, this could be a romantic partner or like a business partner or whatever. Those are all like eighth house topics. Eighth house is also associated with debts or with loans because that's like literally someone else's money that you have borrowed. So debts and loans are associated with the eighth. The topic of death is also associated with the eighth house. So that's, you know, again, that's not like the go-to thing when you're looking at a chart. Just because there's like a planet in the eighth house or something like that, you know, it doesn't mean that, whatever, you're not going to jump right to death. Shared resources and things like that are probably first, although the topic of death is found in the eighth house. And connecting those two things together, the topic of other people's money and death, eighth house is associated with inheritance, like money that you inherit from a parent or, another family member or whatever who passes on and leaves you their possessions. That's another really core eighth house topic is inheritance. And then in some traditional texts, like especially in some like medieval sources, the eighth house can associate with like, I put it in quotation marks here. The distinction between like low magic and high magic is something that's not extremely useful, though it can be nice as just sort of a base kind of indication. So like low magic was often associated with the eighth house and things like necromancy, which obviously is associated with death. And some of those types of magic are traditionally associated with the eighth house. But yeah, I mean, you can make of that what you will, and certainly even in modern astrology, the eighth house is sometimes associated with like the occult and those sorts of topics. All right, ninth house. So the ninth house is the joy of the sun, which is opposite to the third house, which was the joy of the moon. So where the third house was the house of goddess, the ninth house is the house of God, right? So we have the sun and moon as like God and goddess. So the ninth house is a cadent house. It's declining from the 10th, and it's making a superior trine to the ascendant. The ninth house is, above ground. Excuse me. The ninth house is above ground, and it's opposite to the third house. So yeah, we can think about some of this stuff as having a contrasting relationship with the third house. So the ninth house is often associated with religion, philosophy, general worldview, or your kind of your philosophy, both as a kind of academic topic of philosophy, as well as just like philosophy in the broader sense of like, oh, my personal philosophy, or the way that I view the world, the way that I think of reality. That's all like ninth house kind of topics. Religion and spirituality are associated with the ninth. Higher education, where we saw like primary education being associated with the third house, higher education is associated with the ninth house. And I've definitely seen, I know a few people with some strong ninth house placements who have, like PhDs or graduate degrees. You'll definitely see some of that stuff involved with the ninth house, or people who spend a lot of time studying, philosophy or spiritual or religious topics. It's pretty common to see those people with either strong placements in the ninth house, or the planet that rules the ninth house being like strong and prominent in the chart. Also, where the third house was like short distance travel and like local routines, the ninth house can be like long distance travel. The ninth house can also be related to foreign things, places, and people. They can all be associated with the ninth house. The ninth house is also associated with esoteric philosophy, with divination is very commonly associated with the ninth house, and with sort of quote unquote high magic would be associated with the ninth. All right. Now, some of this stuff, like we're talking about, like divination and magic and stuff like that, those, in just like reading some person's birth chart, those wouldn't be the things you would just jump to. But anyone listening to this talk is interested in magic. So I included some of the more like esoteric topics of the houses because of the audience that will be listening to this. You wouldn't just look at just anybody's chart and see places in the ninth house and go like, oh, you're a magician or whatever, right? Yeah. All right, so now the 10th house. It's another angular house, and it's the top of the chart. Again, as we said, the midheaven isn't always found within the 10th house, though the 10th house is always the highest part of the ecliptic at any given moment. So the 10th house has this sense of being like prominent and high, and something being at like the peak of its power. Yeah, above ground, it's making a superior square to the ascendant, and it's also opposite to the 4th house. So where the 4th house was home, the 10th house is like work and career, right? And that's a very obvious like opposition between home and work. And those are really like core life topics, of course. So the 10th house signifies prominence. Things that you're like well known for. Things like reputation are associated with the 10th. Like what career. Not everyone has like a career in sense of like a job that is part of their career, but it could like your work in the world. Whether or not you get paid for that, the things that you like most fundamentally do, and that you're really like engaged in, whatever your work in the world is, that's associated with the 10th house. So yeah, but career and vocation are going to be relevant for most people. Your reputation, as we said, is associated with the 10th. And now because the 10th is making a superior square to the ascendant, the 10th house can also be people that have a kind of superiority relationship to you. So things like superiors, as well as like a boss at work and things like that, those things can be associated with the 10th house as well, because it's something that has can kind of, people that can tell you what to do, that could be associated with the 10th house as well. All right, 11th house. So 11th house is the joy of Jupiter, and is the house of good daimon, or the house of good spirit. When we start with the 5th house, the 5th house was the house of good fortune. So the 11th house is the house of good daimon, or the house of good spirit. And as we'll see, that the 12th house will be the house of like bad daimon. And so this is part of like an idea of that there being like two spirits that accompany each person, like one that's tasked with bringing you good fortune, and one that's tasked with bringing you bad fortune. We're not talking about like moral qualities of good and evil, but just of like things that benefit you versus things that like challenge you. So the 11th house is associated with the good daimon, or the good spirit. It's the succeedent house, so it's rising up to the 10th house. It's making a superior sextile to the ascendant. It's above ground, and as we said, it's opposite to the 5th house. The 11th house can signify friends, peers, colleagues, any kind of like positive, beneficial, generally beneficial social group can be associated with the 11th house. Things like alliances. If you're like a member of like an esoteric order or something like that, you might see some of that stuff like showing up in the 11th house. Like I have the most positive planet in my chart. It like rules my 11th house, and definitely being a member of an initiatory order has been one of the most positive things in my life, right? So you can see some of that stuff. And most of my friends are involved in. Most of my close friends are either members of the same order or are involved in similar sorts of activities. So the 11th house can really speak to like social groups and all that, whether formal or informal, as well as more like colleagues and peers in relationship to a career. Because again, the 11th house is rising up to the 10th. So the 11th house can like support career. And so that can be like colleagues and peers in your vocation. Also, things like the audience can be associated with 11th house. And this is interesting, another thing with opposite the 5th, where the 5th is like art and the arts. The 11th house could be like the audience that receives the arts. Like the audience for the thing that you do. And you'll definitely see, let's see, I've heard a number of people use Kurt Cobain's chart as an example of this. Someone who's, like still has, like 20 or almost 20 years after his death, he still has like a really devoted fan base. And he had some really, he has like an exalted Jupiter, as well as another planet as well in his 11th house. So, that one won't necessarily be relevant for everyone, but for someone who does something where they have a large audience, the 11th house can signify some of that stuff. You'll see in a bunch of politicians too, a number of prominent politicians have some very strong, like Bill Clinton has some very strong like 11th house placements, and a handful of other politicians as well also all have strong 11th house stuff. All right, the 11th house can also be associated with things like hopes and aspirations are associated with the 11th. And also prayer is sometimes traditionally associated with the 11th as well. And we see that coming in through some of the idea of Jupiter, right? Jupiter is associated with religion. We have like priestcraft. And so we see some of that significations, some of those significations coming into the 11th house as well. All right. And then our last house that we'll talk about here is the 12th house. So the 12th house is the joy of Saturn, and is the house of bad daimon, or the house of bad spirit. Now, again, this doesn't mean evil. We're not talking about this in a moral sense, but just in the sense of like things related to the spirit that are more difficult and are more challenging. And this is opposite to the 6th house, where the 6th house was the house of bad fortune. And we saw that associated with more like physical, material challenges. The 12th house is associated with less physical and less material challenges. So the 12th house is a cadent house and is declining from the ascendant. And so because it's declining from the ascendant, moving away from the ascendant, this means, or this is because the 12th house was the previous rising sign. So, if you have a Leo rising in your chart, your 12th house would be Cancer, right? And so Cancer was the previous rising sign before Leo was rising. So just an hour or maybe 2 hours earlier, Cancer was rising, right? So yeah, it was the last rising sign. And so again, because the 1st house was associated with birth, the 12th house was associated with the period right before birth. So the period that your mother was in labor, or the going into labor in general, was associated with the 12th house, because that would be the sign that was rising, just a little bit before you were born. And so, yeah, we see some of the significations of the 12th house coming through that association with like the period of labor and the period that precedes birth. Now, this is much more prominent, in the ancient world. But that period of time, the period of being in labor, is a very dangerous period. Both for the mother, and for the new child that's being brought into the world. Right, that was a very risky and dangerous time. And so that association really colors the 12th house. And it's also a very liminal kind of time too. And we see that liminality with the 12th house as well, where prior to birth, the fetus still in the mother's womb was considered to just be part of her body. And then at birth, that's when, you become like a separate being. You're separated from the mother and you become your own independent being at the moment of birth. The 12th house is kind of like the liminal state where you're in the process of separating from the mother, but haven't fully done it. So there's this kind of like liminal period of like, is it one being? Is it two beings? Right? There's a kind of like liminal or intermediary sort of period that's associated with the 12th house as well. I said it's a dark house. It's no whole sign aspect to the ascendant. It's above ground and it's opposite to the 6th house, as we said. And so, yeah, 12th house significations involve like liminal phenomena. So any sort of strange, kind of like dream states and things like that. A lot of that stuff can be associated with the 12th house. Also things like dangers, again, we're associating danger with the 12th house, with enemies, and especially like kind of secret enemies or seek challenges that maybe you're not fully consciously aware of. Whether that's literal, like other people, or enemies in a more abstract sort of sense. The 12th house, and again, some of this is coming through the association with Saturn. The 12th house is associated with isolation, solitude, also meditation. Meditation would be like a very positive 12th house significance. And if you think like going on a meditation retreat, that is a very 12th house kind of thing to do. You're isolated, you're in solitude, and if you've ever done, a couple days of very like intensive long meditations, you'll know that all kinds of really weird stuff starts to happen when you've been in that state for a few days in a row. A lot of that really strange liminal things, like little bits of like memories that you're not even sure maybe your memories or someone else's memories, like all that really weird sort of liminal stuff is associated with the 12th house. The 12th house can be associated with inner struggle. Again, those sort of less material challenges and struggles, and is often called the house of self-undoing. That's a really common thing you'll see even in modern astrology, that idea of self-undoing. And the 12th house can also be associated with loss in general. All right, so we're just at about an hour and a half. Just a few more minutes here, and then we'll be done. All right, so the midheaven, as we say, and the IC, as we said, will often be found outside of the 4th and the 10th. So it's very common to see this, the MC in the 9th or in the 11th, and you'll get, the higher you go in latitude, the further you go from the equator, the more extreme this will go. So you start getting up into Canada or like Northern Europe or whatever, you'll start to see the MC like in the 8th house or in the 12th, or when you get really far up, like close to the Arctic Circle, you can even get the MC like all the way down, like almost with the descendant or the ascendant. But yeah, commonly you'll see it in the 9th or the 11th. If not actually in the 10th. And so the idea is that the MC is always associated with the 10th house topics of like career and work in the world. So the MC will always carry some of those 10th house topics with it. And so this will both, a planet that's close to the MC, no matter what house that's in, that planet will there'll also be some 10th house significations. It'll always relate to career and vocation and work in the world. And it'll also tend to connect whatever house it's in to the 10th house. So if you have the MC in the 9th, that'll sort of connect together 9th and 10th house topics. So, like education, religion, spirituality, those things might somehow be related to your career or to your vocation. And then the MC is more prominent and more important usually than the IC, but the same sort of thing, the IC carries those 4th house significations of home and foundations. It brings those into whatever house it's found in. Now we also have the idea of planets that are approaching the actual degree of the angle themselves. So planets that are, a planet that's like in this part of the chart right here is like approaching the ascendant. Planet that's over here is like approaching the midheaven. Planet here is like approaching the descendant. A planet that's on its way to the angle and will be there soon, by diurnal motion, that strengthens and makes that planet more prominent. Whereas a planet that's, kind of like over here or here is declining away from the angle, is no longer at the angle, and that'll be like less prominent. let's see. I don't, we don't really have time to get into it, but if a planet it found one of the dark houses in the the second, sixth, eighth, or 12th, you can look to see if that planet makes a close degree-based aspect to the MC, and that can be kind of like a mitigating factor for some of the difficulties involved in the sixth house. I've heard people talk about people with like placements in the sixth house, right, associated with like physical challenges and things like that are configured closely to the midheaven, will sometimes be someone who like has a career involving that thing, like working in healthcare or in medicine or something like that, so that you see those sixth house significations, but rather than being that person themselves like struggling with those topics, instead those topics are like related to what they do for a living. Yeah. All right, yeah, just last couple of things here before we wrap up. So the planets that rule the houses that their domiciles are identified with in a particular, the planets rule the houses that their domiciles are identified with in a particular chart. So this is just an example here, like this is a Taurus rising chart. So Taurus is the first house, so Venus is the ascendant lord. Then Gemini is the second house, so Mercury is like the lord of the second house. So when you're looking at second house topics, you know, for a person with Taurus rising, you're going to want to look at Mercury. You know, of course, you look at planets in the second house, but you also look at what Mercury's condition is. If Mercury is strong and prominent, or Mercury has like close beneficial relationships to Venus or to Jupiter, that'll be like a good signs for second house topics like finances and resources. So when delineating a house, one of the things you always want to look at is what planet rules that house, and then both what that planet is, just by its inherent nature, right? Like a house ruled by Mars, you'll see those Mars significations in that house, but you also want to look at the condition of Mars in the particular chart. Yeah, right. So the planet that rules that house is responsible for that domain of life. Yeah, so that's something that you definitely want to pay attention to whenever you're trying to investigate a particular topic in a chart. You want to know about somebody's career. You look at what planet rules the 10th house, as well as any planets that are in the 10th house, and that'll tell you about the person's career, right? So in this chart, Aquarius, is the 10th house here. So if you wanted to know about this person's career, you'd look at Saturn, and just general significations of Saturn may very well be related to this person's vocation or career. And then also the particular condition of Saturn, where Saturn is in the chart, what sign it's in, what relationship Saturn has. Those things will all color that topic of career and vocation. All right, so yeah, just sort of summarizing some of what we were just saying here. For delineating a house, for interpreting or understanding a house in a given chart, we ask, what sign that house is, and what the basic qualities and significations of that sign are. And, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, the basic qualities and significations of the signs. Are there any planets there in the house? What are their inherent natures? And then what is their current condition? Is it a benefic or a malefic with the sect in favor or against the sect? Is it receiving beneficial or detrimental aspects? Is it have dignity or debility? Is it in detriment or fall in that sign, or is it exalted or in its rulership in that sign? Again, as we said, what planet rules the house? What is its nature? What is its condition? And which other planets influence that planet? What aspect does the ruler make to the house? So, like in the previous chart here, when we were looking at, Mercury ruling the second, we'd also want to look at, if Mercury was found someplace other than the second house, we'd want to look at what aspect that house or that sign makes to the second. Right, I hope that makes sense there. What aspect the ruler makes to the house that it rules. And so if it makes a whole sign aspect to that house, especially if it's one of the more beneficial aspects, that'll be good, and the planet will be sort of well equipped to manage the topics of that house. But if it doesn't make a whole sign aspect to the house, it'll be less capable of managing those affairs. Also, which house is the ruler located in? If in that previous chart there, if Mercury was found somewhere other than the second, which house is it that it's found in? That'll often connect those topics together. So if Mercury ruling the second was in the fourth house, it'll sort of connect together second house topics and fourth house topics. Maybe somehow you get your livelihood through family or through property that you own. Maybe you earn money through property that you own or something like that. It connects together second house topics and fourth house topics. And then, as I said, planets sometimes in the opposite house, sometimes you'll see some of the nature of that planet in that house as well. So if you're looking at like the second house, you might want to consider if there are any planets in the eighth house. You might see some of their significance in the second house as well. All right, and then, very last slide before we're finished here. We can talk about planetary versus house significations. One thing to remember, this is a mistake I found myself making a lot very early on, was thinking that planets, their significations were entirely restricted to the house that they're in, right? So like a planet in the second house only talks about your finances. That's not the case. For one thing, that planet will rule, well, unless you have like the sun in the sun in Leo or the moon in Cancer, except for that case, a planet like in a house will rule some other house. So that planet will definitely be involved in some other topic, right? Like in this house here, in this just chart here, even if Mercury was in Gemini in the second house, Mercury also rules the fifth house. So Mercury's significations, even if Mercury was in the second house and ruling the second house, still wouldn't be restricted to the second house because Mercury would also be ruling the fifth house. But in addition to that, the planets also have their own like natural significations. And so you'll also see that the houses are just one layer. They don't restrict the planets' meanings. Right, so let's see, what did I have on the slide here? So yeah, so it's important to note that planets, maintain their role as the general significators for the topics associated with that planet, right? So whenever you're looking at, relationships, actually I've got the example here. Let me just stick to my slide. Right, so the general significators for the topics associated with that planet, regardless of which house they are found within and which house they rule. So to examine a given topic within a nativity, like or a birth chart, multiple significators must be taken into account. So for example, to examine relationships within a house, within a given chart, you'd always want to look at Venus. Venus will always speak to a person's relationships, no matter what planets are in the seventh, no matter who rules the seventh, and no matter where Venus is found, Venus will always speak to relationships. So you'd always want to look at Venus, where she's found, whether she's, in a night chart or a day chart, what her dignity is, whether she's like exalted or in fall or in detriment or whatever. What aspects she's making, what house she's placed in, that'll always be significant for talking about relationships. Then you'd also look at the seventh house. Again, as we went through on the previous slide, you'd want to delineate the seventh house. And then there are other topics as well that you can find, like there's something called the lot of Eros, and other topics as well that can speak to relationships. So whenever there's always multiple significators for a given topic in a chart, and you want to look at those things. Whenever looking at a relationship, it's never just one single thing, and a given planet never signifies a single topic by itself. So I said to you, when signifiers of a topic give conflicting indications, right? So maybe Venus is in a really like strong place in a chart, and it looks really beneficial, but the seventh house looks more difficult, right? So you have kind of like a conflicting indication. One thing that would indicate strong and beneficial relationships, another thing that would indicate more difficult relationships. You'll tend to get both. And this will happen more commonly than not. In general, when in most people's charts, when delineating any given topic or planet, you'll see a mixture of things. Maybe the planet's in a sign that they're really happy to be in, but they're getting a difficult aspect. Maybe they're in a beneficial and strong house, but something else is more difficult. You'll often see these kind of mixed bag situations, and that's normal. What's much more important to pay attention to is when everything agrees, when all the signifiers for a given topic, where everything about a planet is all lining up, either like very strong or very positive or very difficult. Those are the things to really pay attention to. Most of the time, you're going to get mixed bags. And you'll experience ups and downs in relationship to that topic. Like, most people with finances will have ups and downs. There'll be periods in your life when your finances are more difficult, other periods when finances are more challenging, and that's just normal. So you'll expect to see these kind of, mixed bag situations, and that's very normal. And when using timing techniques, we can look at when the more difficult things are activated and when the more beneficial things are activated, and those will often correspond with the different ups and downs. Let's see, so Kristen's saying, so when a house is empty, if you look to where the planet is that rules the empty house, would that give some insight into the situation in the person's life for the empty house? Yeah, exactly. Right, so I won't spend much time going through it here, but obviously, like if you were interested in, like seventh house topics in Jack Parsons' chart here, there's no planets in the seventh, but the seventh house is Sagittarius here. So Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. So you'd look at Jupiter and look at Jupiter's condition and say, okay, Jupiter's in the ninth house. So there's a relationship between seventh house topics and ninth house topics, right? And you definitely see that in Parsons' life. And his seventh house will somehow be just sort of related to the nature of Jupiter and the condition of Jupiter, right? Jupiter's not the most beneficial planet here. It's a night chart, so Jupiter's a little more of a middle condition, so not extremely negative or positive. But as we said, Venus is helping out Jupiter here, so Jupiter gets some benefit from Venus, and so all that stuff colors the seventh house because it's ruled by Jupiter. So the condition and then placement and location of Jupiter tells you about the seventh house. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're over time as always. Thanks everybody for your patience. Yeah, there's I'm sure you all are aware of my usual spiel at the end. There's my contact info with $5 just a donation for anyone who's not a member of the academic or initiatory track. And if you'd like more information about our work, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. Yeah, if anybody has any follow-up questions or anything like that, I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes, but you may be ready to take off. And yeah, we just got one class left. And so as I was saying in our final class, we'll do some wrap-up and some overview and a few just miscellaneous things related both to astrology and to some of the magic we've been talking about and some other connected topics, and then some summary stuff. So yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks, and we'll wrap up this series. Yeah, and again, I'll definitely post the slides. I'll try to get all this stuff up a little earlier than I did last time, but I'll definitely post the slides for you to be able to review, and of course the video will go up on YouTube if you want to review any portions of that. So yeah, and again, this is just an introduction to help you sort of get started and to get like an overview of this stuff. You definitely want to seek out other online sources and books and other teachers and things like that. This is just an introduction and an overview to the topic. So yeah, so everybody watching on YouTube, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates for more. And yeah, 93s everybody. We'll talk to you soon.